Good morning, everybody, and welcome to another SkySwitch webinar. I'm Andy Abramson, and I am delighted to have you back as part of our first series webinar, Post Vectors. We're talking all about compliance today and why it's so important for you to understand what you need to do in order to do things the right way with your business. We are fortunate to be joined by Joe Mercado. Joe is a good friend. He represents the Compliancy group. Some of you may have seen him at Vectors. He gave a real whiz-bang presentation. Those who weren't there, well, you're going to see parts of it today and learn more. But most of all, you're going to learn why compliance is so important, especially in the world of Hipaa. Hello, Joe.
Hello, Andy. I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you. Much appreciated. And welcome, everybody. Thank you for inviting us to the webinar. Andy, I didn't know if you were finishing up with the questions or anything like that, but if you want me to go, I can step in.
You know, we always say that our webinars aren't just straight presentations, they're a conversation. And we're delighted that so many people have registered, and hopefully they all tune in. Let's just talk a little bit about, the fact that what Compliancy Group does and how they do it and why it's so important. Because I don't think, and I can really tell you after talking to people at Vectors and having been in the industry as long as I've been in it, that people really understand the risk factors involved and thinking that, well, because SkySwitch is HIPAA compliant, I am. Why don't you give some background?
Sure. Yeah, no, that's a very common thing we hear. And one of the things is, if you're looking at the screen, obviously it's you're in healthcare too, right? So as a provider in the space, it's something that's not a common language here for us on the channel. Is we don't think of ourselves as being in healthcare, but as these regulations move forth and they summon different law, and you are now under that regulation. So I want to talk a little bit more about sort of where that fits for you, right? So you're using SkySwitch, like Andy said, and you might even have a business associate agreement in place, and that takes care of some of the needs for your compliance, especially on the security and the tool set side, right? But as we'll talk about today, there's a lot more that goes into your compliance. And as we see here, there's two different types of entities. You have a covered entity on the left. That could be your types of clients and people that you think of when you think of medical information. Think of insurance providers, doctors' offices, people I use my insurance card for that might treat or do payment collections of protected health information. But you, on the other side, you're going to be a business associate, which you have potential access to that information. And it wasn't until 2013 when they actually put this omnibus rule in here that you had to actually comply with the law. So Andy, this was definitely a change for a lot of folks coming out and not really seeing themselves as being in healthcare. There wasn't a lot of enforcement. And all of a sudden they get thrust into all of a sudden have to do everything based on what's happening in the market. So we understand, and that's why there's a 94% failure rate. So I'm glad there's organizations like SkySwitch and the partnerships we have to try to come downstream and really educate your members on exactly what it is that they have to do legally, and also the opportunities that compliance brings downstream.
Don't a lot of resellers and partners think that the BAA, the Business Associates Agreement, is something that's very transitive between SkySwitch and their customers? And isn't that one of the biggest mistakes that causes them to fail the audit?
Oh yeah, and it's a very common thing that we hear all the time, that if you, even before working with organizations like yours, we had to get involved very heavily because of what was happening, where they would come to us and they would say, hey, look, we are compliant, right? We signed this BAA with our provider, and they said that made the technology. They're saying that because of that BAA in place, that the technology is okay to use in my client's environment. And that is true, where a portion, again, of your compliance is going to be following the tool sets that you provide, which ultimately, let's say, is SkySwitch's responsibility sometimes on those tool sets, which also enables SkySwitch needing to be compliant, and they're authorized to sign that BAA, but that doesn't make your organization or your practice or you as a reseller or of SkySwitch's solutions, that doesn't cover you for your own compliance. That is a very, very common thing. There's a lot more that goes into it than just signing that BAA.
What are some of the usual dings that cause someone to fail an audit? I know we're going to talk all about what Compliancy Group does, but I think it's important that our resellers understand some of the biggest failures that lead to not passing the audit, because the number of resellers who fail, the number of companies who fail is quite high, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. There's an actual 94% failure rate. You might have heard me say it before, but that is coming directly from Health and Human Services, who's actually in charge of this HIPAA compliance and protection of people's medical information. They would actually send out the Office of Civil Rights. And also the state enforcement is now picking up steam. You have individual states that are actually enforcing. So the enforcement effort's coming a little bit stronger than it had been in the past. And people are just not prepared. I think the best way to put it, we'll go through what an effective compliance plan today looks like, but a lot of times it's bits and pieces. I mean, I would say that if you've been following me for a while, you'd probably hear me say that constantly, because that's a very common thing, that they do something for compliance, but they're not able to pass an audit. And I think that's a very, very common thing.
Well, let's dig into some of the things that you're doing and some of the things that Compliancy Group is all about.
Sure. Thanks, Andy. Appreciate that. So folks, again, very important. You are under that regulation and under that gun as well. So very quickly about Compliancy Group and maybe a little bit about why SkySwitch had chosen Compliancy Group for their own internal compliance. We truly give a true validation on compliance. So what that seal is that you see, it's a proven methodology that you would have gone through a process. You actually obtain this seal, and it's endorsed by most major medical associations. So you actually look and feel the part of being a vendor or an entity of choice by somebody who's actually checked and balanced their own compliance. And it's hard to do that, Andy. There's actually no certification for HIPAA compliance. So what happens is a lot of entities feel, well, I'm just doing some basic stuff. There's no real certification and I should be fine. And then when an audit comes, they're just pressed against the gun, and they don't have what they don't have things that they should have had, they should have known about, and they just are left with nothing. So we do find that a lot, just bits and pieces. So Compliancy Group is really known in healthcare as these auditors that would validate your compliance. In the history of Compliancy Group, we've been in business since 2005. Large scale, mid scale, whether it's a doctor's office, dental practice, hospital system, nursing home, VoIP providers, managed service providers, hosting companies, you name it, Compliancy Group works with them. And the claim to fame for Compliancy Group in a world where there's a 94% failure rate, we've never actually had a client ever fail an audit. So it's very important to understand that if you or your clients, and I'll get into more ways, again, you get into potential sticky situation, you don't actually get a fine for breaching PHI or having, let's say, something go wrong with protected health information. That would simply trigger an audit by the government, who would then determine what your level of compliance is. And that's where that 94% failure rate comes in. So Andy, like we talk about all the time, I think it's important for the resellers and people on this call to, whether it's Compliancy Group or anybody else, having that true validation. And if you take SkySwitch, for example, Andy, you were keen a little bit on the HIPAA regulation and you guys knew what you were doing, but in a world where there was that heavy failure rate, you probably didn't want to give yourself your own test and grade it.
No, we certainly didn't, but that's why you have Compliancy Group, because you're an outside party and you're staying abreast of all of the changes that go on with HIPAA, and you're working that into your compliancy audits to make sure people comply and are regulatory compliant. That's really important. That's the whole idea of a SaaS model. You do the work, you keep everybody safe.
Yep. Well said. Well said. And that's what we find a lot of times. A lot of the partners we work with, they are very straight out going to tell their clients that, right? Yes, this is not my full realm, right? Because maybe a lot of the compliance stuff, as we'll get into, it's not something you deal with on a daily basis, even as an IT firm or a service provider. A lot of that stuff is non-technical. So I think you're very much the way HIPAA is being enforced, the way people are struggling with it, you're very much wanting to relate to your clientele downstream and be the same as being in healthcare, and it's a problem that you deal with as well. I think they'll appreciate you for that. This is just a slide. It just very quickly, we're a SaaS application for compliance, right? We have everything you need built into our solution. If you want more information, please do let us know. But we have a complete puzzle here and a true validation at the end of that framework for you to take advantage of. This is an interesting topic, Andy. So that, again, just starts that track of, what do I have to do to be compliant? I thought I'm already compliant using SkySwitch's technology, which is part of the security that HIPAA requires. But there's really these two different elements, and that soft side of compliance really could come back to bite you, especially in an audit situation. So when you talk about, let's say, the difference here and really how to illustrate what you guys are looking at, if I look on the right-hand side, and I'll dig more into it in the coming slides, but this is exactly part of what SkySwitch helps you deliver, right? You're using HIPAA compliant technology, HIPAA compliant VoIP services, right? SaaS applications, and you're signing that BAA that states that that application is secure enough to be in that environment and is then HIPAA compliant, except it's only a piece of the pie, right? So even whether it's yourself for your compliance or whether it's your client's compliance downstream, the technology is really mitigating the risk of what is a breach from happening. But when you actually get a breach of information, like we talked about, that would trigger an audit. The only defense you have in that audit is your overall compliance plan. And that dabbles into a lot more than just some of the technology and some of the BAA agreements we have in place. So ultimately, what we like to say, it's an opportunity for the resellers. It's something to educate even the clients downstream, because that's really what gives them ultimate safety, right? So let's say you're a managed service provider. You're not just doing some VoIP services and you want to get more in security. I would argue security equals safety for that client, and compliance could be a very, very big part of that safety, as it mandates actually the need for ongoing security. So a lot of our partners would actually leverage compliance, not the only thing they want to sell, but it's definitely tying directly and giving the client rhymes and reasons to actually do and purchase certain tool sets that you may have.
When you talk about requiring ongoing management, what are some examples of what Compliancy Group does to make sure that that management becomes almost transparent to the reseller?
Yep. So a lot of the Compliancy Group, actually, it makes sense that, I was going to go into a little bit about what we do there. Actually, I would fast forward to that. That makes a lot of sense. So Compliancy Group is really about holding your hand through a process, and we would actually hold the hand of the client as well. This is nothing you have to be fully knowledgeable in order to, to resell. There's an actual HIPAA coach on our side, and they guide the client and you through what is an effective compliance plan. So there's a way we help you achieve it using our coaching. So really, it's just about selling the license downstream, relating to that client. It's a 94% failure rate. You're in the same boat as them. You're getting your compliance done. Why not them? And chances are Compliancy Group's endorsed by their national association as the only endorsed solution to become compliant. So it might make sense there. So we hold the client's hand, hold your hand. We also help you illustrate it with our seal and our response program. If you ever get into an audit, we're there, and we help you maintain it over time. But really what we do, that HIPAA is really going to require a series of audits that we would take charge of, work with the account, make sure they get the right answers to, and same for you as a reseller. You would have to go through these audits as well. Again, the same regulation for you as it is for them. So really having somebody to go through those audits, understand the questions, get the right answers, identify your gaps, track all your remediation efforts. We actually do all your policies, procedures, and training. So if you have to implement some technology that might have to be done, outside of that, we would do the documentation for you. So a lot of nuance goes into the documentation that we take advantage on our side of our expertise as auditors to create that stuff for you, knowing what an auditor wants to see. You hear about training all the time. It's probably the most common thing you hear when it comes to HIPAA compliance is HIPAA training. I train my staff, or I have a BAA. That's the other one. Again, piece of compliance. We do that as well. The employees get trained using our platform. Vendor agreements. So if you're seeing that SkySwitch agreement, it's probably same one that Compliancy Group has. We have the BAA agreements. We help you put those in place. And then ongoing incident management. So you actually have a coach there. If you ever get into a breach or a sticky situation, remember that could trigger an audit. And potentially you have somebody here to help guide and support you throughout the year if you do run into any sticky situation. So what we like, Andy, is that full hand-holding support, not just here is a widget, Andy, check off the box and you should be okay, and call us if you need support. I think what you'd find with Compliancy Group is why we're endorsed so heavily is you have the coaching and we stick with that client. Our coaches, and I'm not afraid to say it, they are actually incentivized to get you through that process, and that helps. We learned long ago that if I just leave a tool set on site, and say, hey, fill out these questions, we come back 6 months later, it's just not going to be done.
So you do the heavy lifting. You make it easy for everybody.
Correct.
That's so cool.
So I just want to go back here after that security versus compliance slide. So that's why it's important to bring those worlds together, right? When you do all that stuff, it's a combination of both of these elements, right? It's very important to understand that. And Andy had said that, and the reason we're here again is these are becoming front and center, where maybe 5 years ago, you're thinking as a provider, come on, Joe. But no, this is happening. Audits are happening. Client negligence could lead to an audit for you. Random audits by the government, potential breaches that you actually need to report could be a trigger of an audit. So just so you guys know, if you try to brush up, let's say you breach medical information, or your client breaches medical information, and it's not reported. If they find out 5 years ago, 3 years ago, 2 years, from now, the idea that breach triggered from you and you didn't report it to the government, there's a fine that potentially comes your way. Average HIPAA fine is 1.5 million. And then they also do an audit based on that breach that you had triggered. And then that would be another potential fine based on your lack of compliance. So actually reporting on yourself is becoming sort of the norm, but unfortunately it's one of those evil things that we just have to do. It's actually the right thing to do if you think about it. Bad for the business, but good for the people's medical information. They really should know if something was happening. So we're seeing more and more ways that these business associates can actually get into an audit situation. And a lot of times, Andy, like we talk about again, tech is not the problem when it comes to these audits. I think there's so many different ways nowadays you can get into audits, but a lot of people always believe, if I have good security, I'm never going to have an audit by the government because I'm protected. It's a double-edged sword that you look at the statistics there. It's the own employees and sometimes the IT professionals or somebody on this call might be on site with a client and they leave a port open or they do something silly or they have an employee and we all think it's not going to happen to us. But what if our employee did something malicious or they took a video and put it on social media because they saw somebody famous at the place they were at? Stuff like that. A lot of different ways that you could be the center of attention very quickly by the government.
Well, I think that's very, very relevant, and today especially because we know the government's looking.
Yeah, and like we said years ago, it's funny because Compliancy Group, we started where it was just really large scale enterprise type accounts. Like we had Kaiser Permanente or a city of Plano, Texas, or LA County, all 9 of the major hospitals. And that's really was our bread and butter for the longest time. I mean, 2015, 16, when we knew that law was changing, we started to change our model. And nowadays, if you look at Compliancy Group, most of our clients are small, mid-sized businesses, providers in the IT and telco space, and a mix between mid-enterprise and enterprise, but a definitely heavier concentration I've seen. I've been here about 6.5 years, and I can definitely see the change towards the small, mid-sized entity and the vendors in the space for sure. Okay. So tech is not normally the problem, right? What are we talking about here, right? What sort of takeaways can I bring away from this webinar? The idea that, Joe's talking about security, but what does that mean? There's not, out of all the rules of HIPAA, this is not going to be, as my director said, trying to learn HIPAA, 700 plus pages, a law written by lawyers to be interpreted by more lawyers. Sounds very fun, right? Don't you guys want to learn that today? Probably not so fun. I'd rather, poke my eyes out with a fork and light my hair on fire than try to read and understand that regulation. I hate to be crude, but that's exactly what's going on. If you try to read that regulation, I'm sure some people are laughing as they're hearing me talk right now. It's hard to make 2 cents. It's hard to get validation. It's hard to understand what it is that they need from you because you're not the LA County hospital system. You're a service provider, for Christ's sake. So the idea is that there's no HIPAA light, right? You can't get HIPAA for providers, HIPAA for hosting companies, HIPAA for dental practices. It is straight up against the regulation. No matter what type of entity you are, you have to figure out your risk profile and how you play into that. But the easiest way I can describe this, you cannot skip a portion of the regulation because you feel that you are, let's say, not a covered entity, or you feel like you are smaller. Joe, I only have 5 employees, 2 employees. You still got to do it, and you got to do it in full. And technology, all you have to know here, out of all this stuff, technology is 1/3 of one rule of HIPAA. And that's really, the technology piece inside of security. You see there, the 3 rules of HIPAA, even for security, technology is 1/3 of one rule. There's other types of security. So that is also a confusing thing, that if I just do my technology, maybe it brings me up to at least the security rule standard for HIPAA compliance. And that's also not the case.
Joe, HIPAA is HIPAA. There's only one standard.
Correct.
It's not like there's variations, as you were talking, dentist, doctor, elder care, rehab facility. HIPAA is HIPAA is HIPAA. And this applies to everything from alcohol and drug rehab centers to your doctor's office, to your medical practice group, if it's a group, to the entire hospital or healthcare facility. It's all the same, which makes it easy for our resellers and partners to be able to take it to market, because they only have to sell one thing to everybody, as opposed to a customized solution, which is what they're selling for telecom and messaging and video conferencing and applications and special functions and features, or doing something that requires a little bit of programming. They're selling one package. That's it.
Yep. Very good point too. And, I don't want to get salesy on this call, but I will say again, with that heavy failure rate, your clients are not compliant. I've been here a long time. I can count on one hand how many entities have gone on a call with me and said, Joe, really, I don't think I need your service. Here's why. I'm doing this, and this. Chances are, and a little tidbit I'll give is, I never ask my clients if they're compliant. I think that's a silly question based on the failure rate. You're going to get the answer of yes, or isn't that your job, or it's a weird answer coming back. And then you feel whatever you say, you're sort of battling them. I would like to ask them what they do for their compliance. Just simply relate to them. You have to go through this as well, right? So after this call, you might be like, gee, I got to get compliant. Well, so do they, right? So I think the open, honest opinion of, hey, look, I'm looking to get compliant. What are you doing for your compliance? They tend not to have a good answer to that question. And there's simple checklists we can give you to make it very simple. And Compliancy Group does a lot of the education for you.
Well, we have an interesting question, which is from Joel Herzog. He wants you to touch on Canadian HIPAA compliancy laws and the restrictions around using vendors from across the border.
Interesting. Very good question. So I would first and foremost, you're going to want to stay with us. That is a very interesting question, Joel. We are releasing the Canadian HIPAA compliance very shortly. It's part of other regulations we are doing. So we just don't do HIPAA. We do OSHA. We do HB 300 for Texas. And there's some cybersecurity regs we play with. And the idea is that we're going to be coming out with the Canadian version of HIPAA. It is very similar, but it is separate. Right. So the idea is, if I am, let's say, PPETA, what they call it, or FIPA certified or compliant, it doesn't mean it can't cross at this point, if that makes sense. So I can't just say, oh, yeah, I'm this, so I'm going to go work in the United States and deal with a HIPAA entity. That's not the way it works. You still have to be HIPAA compliant. So the idea would be it is getting similar. I think they're following similar paths. I think you'll find a lot of overlap, but they are definitely different. And you're going to have to get separate agreements, unfortunately, in place for what is HIPAA in America and the Canadian PIPEDA or FIPA.
How does it apply to using cross-border service providers?
So service providers would have to be compliant specifically with HIPAA. But if you're going the other, so if I'm in Canada and I want to work in the US, even though I'm FIPA or Canadian HIPAA compliant, I still have to get HIPAA compliant.
But if you're working in Canada,
in service,
you'd have to get Canadian compliant.
Correct.
But what about, are they able to use US-based service providers, or does that US-based service provider also need to be compliant in Canada?
That's a very good question. I am going to assume they have to abide by the Canadian rule, just like it very much mirrors HIPAA. So if I'm a US entity who is HIPAA compliant, I'm a vendor, and I'm doing what is required by HIPAA. I mean, we can get the final answer on that, Andy, but I would assume that they are going to have to apply. They have to abide by the Canadian rules, even though they're HIPAA compliant.
But there's no HIPAA treaties like there are tax treaties between countries, so there's no reciprocity.
Correct.
Okay, that should answer your question, but if you'll look into it and get back to Joel, I'm sure.
That's a great question. Yeah.
It was a very good question. One of the best ones actually we've ever had in general. By the way, those of you who are listening in, if you want to ask questions of Joe, go into the Q&A and post them there, not in the chat, in the Q&A, and we'll answer them as they come up sometimes or at the end of our webinar. Joe, this is great. I love having you talk on our webinar. Why don't you talk about one of the biggest,
go ahead.
what I would really call big faux pas that never should have happened?
Oh boy. Yeah. So this guy is, he's made famous by Compliancy Group, unfortunately. And this is, it's an extreme example that is a real example that it could happen in many different types of situations in your business, if you really think about it. Now, this was the National Hurricane Center in Hawaii, and they got an alert, right, that there was an incoming missile attack coming from across the seas, and everybody, I don't know if you all remember that, but everybody was running for cover. They were getting under the desk, and anyway, this guy was involved very heavily, and ended up at the end of the day to be a hoax. But when they were doing a news article on it, he ended up having a picture taken, and if you look very closely, there's sticky notes on his computer that shows his password. Now, this is in the National Center, right? And the idea in Hawaii, you would think that they would file protocols. And yes, maybe not HIPAA specific, but it goes to give you it gives you an idea of what are you going to find in your clients? What are you going to find in your employees when they're doing stuff like this? And this is just one of the many, many, many types of examples of why things can go wrong. So this is an example of something that would put you into an audit based on exposure to a password on a picture that was taken. So, but what fixes that, right? How do you fix that, right? The technology is easy. SkySwitch is giving me a BAA. Their technology is compliant, but somebody like this, my employees, what we talked about before, leading to our own demise. How do you fix that? Well, compliance fixes that, right? The soft side, like we talked about, the things outside of technology, don't get me wrong, again, extremely important. But for things like this, the only way that this would have not happened was this would have been part of the assessments, which was part of the audits I explained in the beginning. There's a series of audits you go through. They then carve out what is certain policies and procedures based on how you handle PHI or how you come in contact with clients that have PHI. And then there's ongoing training efforts. So this guy would have been not only had the physical site walkthrough, which is one of the audits, you would have ripped that thing off his desk or off his computer screen, showed him and said, what the heck are we doing? This is not part of what we do. Here, read this. So here's some policies and procedures. And then he would have attested that he read and understood he shouldn't have done that. So there's a combination of things here that just simple technology protocols that you think is making you secure that wouldn't have even mattered in a case like this. And this is a very common thing we see. If you look in healthcare, like I talked about before, you're finding these weird, and I talk about weird situations. You have a girlfriend's a girlfriend. So there was a boyfriend with a girlfriend who worked at, this is a real place. And it sounds like I'm making this up, but it's true. He worked at a medical facility, and she accessed her the boyfriend's mother's medical records. And for some reason, the mother didn't like this girl. And she ended up suing her, but it was a big mishap in the protected health information. And they got in trouble with that, and they had an audit. It's all over something silly like that, right? So that's what I'm talking about. Stuff like that. Technology is not going to protect you. Policies, procedures, and training. And then this way, you as an entity or your client as a clinic or a practice, they would have been off the hook because they did what they needed to do. They did their technology and they did this stuff to protect themselves. And they would have said, hey, on August 13th at this time, here's when she logged in. She attested to this policy and procedure. She knew she shouldn't have done that. And we also went through, we did an assessment, we did training, and she would have known that this was something she shouldn't have done. So that policies, procedures, and training soft side definitely comes into play more so than you think when it comes to protection. Talked about that, Andy, about how simple we make it. This is interesting too. I would hit on this really quick. So when we do talk about security items, we do talk about, and I don't want to stray too far from the path, right? If you're an MSP on this call, or you're thinking about getting into more security, right? Well, HIPAA mandates security. It's part of the reason we have many resellers of our solution are providers like yourself, is you're trying to potentially sell these services downstream to the client. And I would argue that there's nothing more stickier than them legally needing to do it. So having that stuff together, and there's a lot of stuff that we can give you to arm you and to make you successful at this. And like I said, a lot is done through education that we give, but hopefully you see the value in potentially using compliance. It's not the only thing you want to sell, but legally there's a risk between you and the client. You have to do it anyway. And it pushes down on some of the security that they have to do, right? So that's really why people work with us. They really see, obviously, protection for themselves. They want to see protection for their clients. And then, like I said, if you tie your services to compliance-specific services, just ask SkySwitch. It has a higher value of service, right? So if I sell a VoIP product, or I sell a VoIP product that is HIPAA compliant, it just has a higher value. And then obviously it's less risk for you internally with your own culture and having your own employees go through this. They understand certain things, and it'll help your posture into not getting into that sticky situation. And obviously we all are after more business. So as we all are gaining competition, it seems like every day we have new competition. How do we sort of differentiate ourselves? Well, I'll tell you, with that heavy failure rate, 94%, seems like a good bet that if I'm compliant in the space and I'm concentrating, whether it's in medical or other regulated sectors, that I look and feel the part, right? So it's really important to have that validation, whether it's with Compliancy Group or anybody else, just illustrating that you are doing the right things for yourself. And you'll be surprised what that leads to downstream. Do I think every John the dentist is going to sign with you because you have a seal of compliance and Compliancy Group is endorsed by the American Dental Association? Obviously not. But do I think you're going to win the right deal because you have the seal of compliance? I would say yes.
That's really important. What leads to the big reasons why someone from the SkySwitch universe as a reseller chooses to work with Compliancy Group?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I used to think, Andy, was about making money. A few years ago, it was one of those things where, I can add this into my stack, I can make money, and that is still on the table, obviously. And then as people are needing compliance, that is continuing to grow. So there's money to be made. But we're looking at it from a marketing perspective. I mean, we have more vendors now than you could imagine. And it's really a lot of them are using it as marketing. So if I was to argue that, the couple $1,000s that Compliancy Group is, how much marketing would you do in the sector throughout that year? And, whether I'm somebody like a provider of yours, or if you think about the clients you have downstream, then they might not even be healthcare, right? Think about other business associates that are like you, law firms, accountants, shredding companies, billing companies. They are similar to you, where the doctor is more of you relating to them as being in healthcare, same issue, same problem. We can make the pain go away together. This other situation is more like we're just like you, Mr. and Mrs. Law Firm or accountant or shredding company, billing company, consultant, whoever. We sell to healthcare too. Did anybody ever show you how your own positioning and marketability can help you win business? And I think that that's extremely important. So I think it's the marketability, the differentiation, internally just doing the right thing based on the enforcement effort, and then also obviously making money is also a nice thing to do, and keeping the clients safe.
Well, I think you nailed it right there. It's about keeping companies safe. And this really falls into risk management. And a lot of times telecom resellers don't have a risk manager. Compliancy Group is a risk mitigation service that helps them avoid unknown perils surrounding Hipaa. But if they had a risk manager, one of the first things that would be on his or her checklist would be, are you Hipaa compliant? Are we doing a proper audit? The same way companies that manufacture medical devices have to be ISO 9000 or ISO 9001 compliant. There's always some organization that's written some standard that businesses need to measure up to.
Correct. And it's interesting, Andy, I'm not gonna drill on this really hard, but I do want to show this one more time. So again, whether it's Compliancy Group or anybody else, all the stuff we're talking about today, this is what it means, folks, down to the teeth. There are 6 required audits, and we'll give you some information on what those audits are, but this is it. Audits need to be done. Gaps need to be identified. You have to have a gap analysis correlating to those audits. You have to have remediation efforts addressing those gaps, updated technology, updated policies and procedures, training of the staff, BAA agreements, which we started out talking about, probably have those in place, and then having a full-fledged incident management plan in case things were to go haywire or wrong. So having those things in place, very, very important in your compliance plan. So definitely, we have a checklist on this stuff. We're very fortunate to have a lot of good information and work with good partners like SkySwitch and BCM1 for this. So the idea would be reach out. We have information for you. I know you're probably leaving this webinar thinking, I think I get it, but I don't, so there's more time to dive into it. Feel free to reach out to me. I won't bite you. We'll give you some good information for sure.
Cool. Well, once again, you are a fountain of knowledge and you deliver high value to our community, which I really appreciate. And I know they appreciate. I'm going to quickly dive into our Q&As and see.
Sure.
We have one from Daniel Fisher. He asks, what are the typical costs for an engagement for a small medical practice for the entire network?
Good question. So, I mean, if we're talking about sort of becoming compliant, having a seal of compliance, doing all those things, you're looking at about $2,500 for the year. But there's one kicker, is we don't know what their IT environment looks like. And it's an interesting question because I want to go back here. Outside of, let's say, everything else we talk about, these things are going to remain potential gaps that they have. So cost wise, depending on what they have to put in place, right? They're going to have to get a disaster recovery plan. They're going to have good endpoint protection. Access controls have to be set up. So they might have to hire somebody like an MSP to come in and sort of manage this stuff on a monthly basis. Doesn't have to be extreme, right? Again, risk profile doesn't mean I have to use Fort Knox all the time. And I'm not knocking any of your services at all, but there's different ways to address HIPAA, right? There's other regulation that would say, hey, Joe, you're not compliant until you do this specific encryption, this specific way. HIPAA is more like, did you do something in the category and is it sufficient? So what I'm going to go out on a limb and say is, can they get basic safeguards in place? And then the rest of that HIPAA plan, tough to say, but small practice, few $1,000s, and then another couple thousand to get compliant. they should be within range of 5,000 or under, and that's a good starting point. And then they're on a management fee of those services ongoing.
That's great. At this point, I'm not seeing any other questions from, oh, one just popped in. Nope, that was Daniel. We have no other questions. What that usually means, Joe, is not only is it time to say goodbye, but you did a fantastic job. Up, we got one.
Oh,
Says
spoke too soon, Andy. You see, we're trying to get.
Daniel popped back in with another one. Do you offer similar services for law firms?
Yes, very good question. So, like I said, we service many different types of entities. You'd be surprised how many law firms and different types of clients we have. We're close to about 15,000 accounts. I mean, Hipaa and Compliancy Group, we've been growing very rapidly over the last 10 years. But the idea is law firms, yes, 100%. And that goes in the same category as you, believe it or not. So as a business associate, there's a path that we have for you to become compliant. Remember, same regulation for all. So business associate, they go down a path of compliance. Covered entity, which is usually your doctor's office, hospitals, right? Those type, they go down a path. So yes, we can do any type of entity, and just ask us if you want to reach out. Great question. Happy to give you some resources and references on that side as well.
Well, and one more question from Crystal Webb. Is the process for our clients the same as the process you go through with us as a reseller?
Yes, very good question. So very similar to what I said in that pinwheel. And I should just very quickly, I'll bring this back up. That is our process. You get a coach. They help you go through. We anticipate about, it says 5 to 8 here. On the service provider side, I really believe it's 3 to 4 1-hour meetings. I think overall you're looking at about 6 hours, 7 hours, 8 hours of work, give or take, to actually get our seal of compliance. And then we help you maintain it each year. But really, you have the coach, you have access to the software. We bring you through it. We hold your hand through it. And I think it's going to be about that 6 to 8 hours in order to get through that process. But it is the same process for you as it is for the accounts. The only difference is, as a business associate, remember, we don't deal directly with the PHI as much as a hospital or doctor's office, right? So there's a little bit less in each category, but like we said, HIPAA applies to all. So for example, I'll give you an example, and the rest of the boxes work very similar. You have 6 required audits if you're a covered entity, but as a business associate, even though you're not a covered entity, you're still required to do 5 of those 6 audits. So very similar to what you'll find throughout the other puzzle pieces for HIPAA, which is why we say, let's say your client's more of the 8 to 10 hours, you're more of the 6 to 8 hours. And I say within a month or 2 at the most. Remember, it's your pace. We're not going to, force you to do something you don't have time to do. So let's just say it's a month to 2 months to get that seal of compliance.
Well, that works very well. I want to thank you. You are, as usual, a fountain of information, knowledge, insight, and expertise, which I found everybody with Compliancy Group is. I mean, Paul is dynamic and he's the road warrior. He's out there selling all the time. You have just so much knowledge. Together, you make a dynamic duo. You're like Batman and Robin.
Thank you. Yeah, we try. We like this. We like being in front of the partners and the communities, and that's what's very important is being out there, being a face, seeing us, and we love being thought leaders and educational stuff. We're not just about here sell our product. We want to deliver knowledge to the market, and that's what we've been doing since 2005. So we want to continue that, and we like what we've seen so far. And I want to thank you guys for a great event. We had such a great time and met some great people, and even though we're not the compliance solutions folks, all right, they come to us all the time. We love those guys, by the way, and that's excellent. There is 2 different companies. Compliance Solutions deals with taxes, Compliance Group, HIPAA compliance, but we become very friendly with even that group. Another great group to work with. So weren't really supposed to give them a plug here, but they're a great group. Definitely reach out to them as well if you're having trouble on that side. But it's amazing how the industry comes together, and it's amazing how much compliance, Andy, is entering the space, where if you look back, right, it was not much to be seen a few years back.
Well, I remember in 2019 when I met up with you and your CEO, who I'm drawing a mental
Mark.
Let's say Mark. Yep. Okay. I didn't want to be wrong, Mark. as well as Paul, and we all talked, and I said, why aren't you guys at Vectors? And it took all of about 5 minutes for you guys to say, we're there. And it's been a great relationship the last 3 years, and it's one which I hope continues for many years to come. What's the easiest way for people to reach you?
Oh, that's simple. Either through SkySwitch, if you guys would find, if you ever look to download their BAA, there's a form right there on the site, so they can easily help you, and that'll come directly to me, working with SkySwitch. But if you guys want to take down that number, it's 855-854-4722, extension 515. It's right there on the screen. Or feel free to email me. It's jmacedo, JMACEDO @compliancygroup.com.
Joe Macedo, you have been fantastic today. I want to thank you, and I want to thank the entire team. You guys are so much fun to work with. And what's really great is your presentations are dead on. We don't have to do any editing. We just let you guys go. So everybody, thank you all for tuning in today. If you're listening to the recording, you won't be able to ask any questions. Sorry, but you can always write to Joe and he'll get right back to you. I want to thank Erica Vasquez again for doing such a fantastic job at setting things up, making sure that we're all on time, but most of all, just for being there, because Erica is a rock star. Joe, thank you. But most of all, I want to thank the people who tuned in today, who are part of the SkySwitch family. We'll be back again tomorrow. We've got Darren Knapp from Poly, and he's got a whiz bang of a presentation. So you can tune in again, same time tomorrow, 11 o'clock Eastern, or you can listen to the replay. I'm Andy Abramson. Thank you so much for joining in.
And remember, folks, you're in healthcare too.